who will be discussing Juneteenth and its relevance to today's struggle for liberation. Join me in welcoming Eugene.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate that. So, I appreciate everyone who was able to make it out this afternoon. I know it's a pretty nice day out, so I think Sean already thanked people, but I'll thank you again. How's everyone doing? Well?
Well.
Good. Okay, well, at least one person had to be not doing that great. You gotta keep it 100% real. I'll just do this right now so I don't forget, but I'm gonna pass around these flyers, which are about a Juneteenth event that 1DC is gonna be hosting an upcoming weekends here. I guess is that 2 weeks from now or a week from now? 2 weeks from now. That it's gonna be on June 17th here, and I hope everyone can come, and I think that it's an important and good one last year too. I think we did as well, and I think it's an important holiday for a lot of reasons because, I mean, A, it's an important holiday for what it represents in terms of the end of slavery, but I think even more so because the nature of the holiday, the way it was sort of started and what it represents, and I think why it's even celebrated pretty widespread across the country today, is so directly related to the idea and the needs of social struggle and liberatory movements inside of this country that it's just a good time, I think, to stop and reflect on all the different aspects of our ongoing movement. So, you know, I'll give a little of that history, which I think will speak to the issue of the relevance of Juneteenth today, and then I'll try to close by speaking a little bit, as Yasmina said, about the People's Congress of Resistance, which I think is illuminated quite well by this event that's coming up here at 1DC. So Juneteenth, as some people know, is a celebration of the end of slavery, and it's celebrated on June 19th because in 1865, on June 19th, in Galveston, Texas, there was a General Gordon Granger who had been sent there to essentially sort of retake Galveston. The war, more or less, was over, the Civil War. April 26th, right, I guess, is when Robert E. Lee surrendered, but the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, which was, I think, the last Confederate force on the field, had just surrendered on June 2nd, and Galveston, which had been taken and fallen back to the Confederates, was a big port there. So this was an important piece of the mopping up phase of the Civil War, if you will. And so when General Granger arrived in Galveston, he did a number of things, but one of the things he did from the balcony of the Astor House, which I think was like one of the first 10 brick buildings in Texas, is he read out something called a General Order Number 3 to all the black people who had gathered, which said that slavery was over. And there's sort of some interesting, I think, facets of that, and the basis of this, because the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, had not yet been ratified. So he was doing this under the authority of the Emancipation Proclamation, which wasn't actually really enforced to some degree because the war was technically over, and that was a wartime measure. And so it's just an interesting sort of history because I think we often lose this with Juneteenth, the connection of that order with the overall issue of Reconstruction, and in some ways kind of a starting gun to the Reconstruction post-Civil War period. Because the other thing that the Juneteenth Proclamation says is that you're free, but that the Army won't do anything to help you, so you can't gather around military posts, and that you have to stay on the plantation and work for wages. And that's a little bit of an aside, but it's a very relevant issue because the biggest issue in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War was slaves wanted to own land. But the vast majority of the country's sort of leadership, the Union Republican coalition, did not want that. Even some black Republican leaders, they thought it was going too far, too radical, more than what they really wanted to do. But interestingly enough, this is how sharecropping became the predominant form of labor of black people in the South. Is plantation owners wanted them to work for wages, slaves wanted them to own their own land, and ultimately they ended up with this sort of halfway house agreement. So that's sort of another issue, but I think it's a relevant and important issue about Juneteenth, and the nature of this proclamation was a part and parcel of this idea of what was going to, slavery was over, but what was going to come next. So Granger was a little bit ahead of the Congress, as it were, but nevertheless, I think expressing the truth of the matter, that slavery was absolutely over, that there was no chance that it was going back, and certainly the momentum in the 13th Amendment by that point was, you know, more or less unassailable moving forward. The entrance of black troops into the war had really changed the game. And in fact, Lincoln, right at the time of his second inaugural, made emancipation the biggest issue, because from his perspective, the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure and only pertaining to the property of slave owners was not, in fact, sufficient, and that it could be rolled back quite easily post-Civil War. And one of the things that he later said to someone is that how could he send the black veterans who had fought for the Union back into slavery? There was no way that he could ever make a decision like that. Things had changed irreparably. And I think in and of itself, inside of the country, the idea of who black people were and that they weren't, in fact, property but human beings had changed really as a direct result because of the Union soldiers in the Civil War. And just as an aside, if you're interested, Harper's Magazine, which is still a famous magazine, but was a very famous illustrated magazine, then has there's a thing online that you can find, I can't forget exactly where, but it shows like the depictions of black people from like right when the Civil War started to right when it ended, and how it was like highly racist in the beginning and extraordinarily sympathetic at the end. And one of the photos that they used to show that is the picture of the white Lady Liberty. This is about the 15th Amendment actually, but a white Lady Liberty standing next to this black veteran who only has one leg and is standing on a crutch and saying, how can you not give the vote to this man that fought for the freedom for the country? Something that, even 40 years after that would be considered completely taboo. So an interesting piece there, and an important thing I think about the role of black soldiers and the role they played in generating a new sort of feeling amongst white people in the country, that resulted in this issue. So anyway, another issue that I think is very relevant here too is just Texas and the importance of Texas in this location. It's sort of an interesting place because Texas was where so many of the slave owners from Alabama, Louisiana, Missouri, and Arkansas all fled to as the Union Army started to come down because they were taking the slaves. And so the people who didn't want their slaves taken away, a lot of them said, well, we're just going to go to Texas. And Galveston was a big port, and you could trade across the border with Mexico because the Emperor of France used the Civil War as an attempt to overthrow the government of Mexico at that time and put a puppet regime on there. And so Texas became this big booming center of commerce right towards the second half of the Civil War because of the nature of this. And so really the ending of slavery, I think there, and I think the sort of symbolic value, which I don't think perhaps we didn't see until much later when it became a national holiday, quite relevant. But I think it's just relevant to how all those slaves got to Texas in the first place, an interesting sort of side effect. And the way that it spread, and I mentioned that because the way that the holiday of Juneteenth spread originally was all of these slaves that had gathered, many of them in the interior. And it's important to note, there's a little myth that these slaves had no idea that the Emancipation Proclamation ever happened, which is definitely not true at all. It wouldn't actually make any sense because in Galveston, a port town, that's where people know everything, right? That's the node of all information at that time, is things that come off the ships and go to other places. So they knew about that. But nevertheless, there were so many slaves there from all over this sort of near trans-Texas region that once they were free, well, you had sort of two phenomena. One, you had the people, because slaves in Texas, right, or the newly freed slaves, immediately started to celebrate Juneteenth right afterwards. They had to settle on a different date because it was actually June through August of 1865 that all across Texas, these slaves were being freed. There's a great little story about this, about one guy who's working in a field, and then all these Union soldiers just like swept down on the field with these slaves singing behind them, and they all sort of like swept through and freed people as they passed through these fields. But nevertheless, they decided on Juneteenth, the black people in Texas and their convention movement there, that this was going to be the date. So you have two phenomena right away that spread the holiday to more than just Texas. One, people going back to where they were really from, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, and taking this celebration, this celebratory thing they had done for the first few years in Texas back to where they were originally from. And the other factor, and this is just an interesting thing about Reconstruction history right away, is in addition to land being a crucial issue for the freed slaves, so was one, determining what freedom meant, and two, reuniting families. And so right in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there was like a mass movement of black people all around. Some not that far, some very far, but some people who just were leaving just to prove that they could leave and no one could stop them, and other people who were trying to find parents, children, wives, uncles, nieces, nephews that they'd been separated from because they had been sold off and families broken up, which was quite common during slavery. So nevertheless, people went looking for their families. So those two things combined, people going back to where they're from and some people just moving on, helped turn Juneteenth into kind of a regional sort of southwest holiday that was, you know, actually a big thing in Texas for a long time. Certainly in Alabama, it became a major holiday. In fact, there's like a strawberry soda thing in Alabama now on Juneteenth. That's the thing to do, is drink the strawberry soda. In some places they drink these strawberry pies too. But the red there to represent the blood that was shed by slaves. So nevertheless, yeah, we can. We could also just turn it up. That's the other option. And anyway, long story short, that was the nature of how the thing became more of a holiday in a lot of those states there. There's other places in other states that have emancipation days that are often on other days, though, because of what they heard, right? Like in D.C., Emancipation Day is April 15th, right? And that's because that's when slaves heard about the Emancipation Proclamation. In Virginia, I don't think they ever settled on a date, but I know that in Hampton, at Hampton University, they have something called Emancipation Oak. They do a little thing around there under the trees, the oak, because that's where these slaves gathered. The first slaves to hear about the Emancipation Proclamation. And there's a couple different states that, I think like Florida, I think it's like May 20th is an Emancipation Day, although I don't know if that's a big celebration there, but it is. So nevertheless, even though Juneteenth in and of itself was not celebrated that widely across the black diaspora for a long time, really until the turn of the 20th century. It was a big holiday in a lot of these sort of southwestern southern states, and it was a similar holiday to holidays that existed around the country, specifically in the South, that celebrated Emancipation Days. And because of Reconstruction being a factor from 1865 to 1876, you also had state governments in the South that would raise up Juneteenth as an official holiday, make it a big deal, you know, spend money on it, you know, just make it a big celebration. And so the celebration of Juneteenth is both indigenous to the black community, but then was able to sort of seep out into the body politic, as it were. But as Reconstruction started to phase out, state governments, which then were taken over by white supremacist movements, started to sort of change the things that they were celebrating, and they started celebrating Confederate holidays. They started putting up all those monuments, like the big controversy now around Confederate monuments. Those didn't start to be built until, a lot of them after 1900, from like 1900 to 1920, but starting in the 1880s and 1890s, as these white supremacist governments kicked the black people out of the government, disenfranchised them, and then started to say, well, we're going to celebrate our own history and forget your history. So Juneteenth certainly continued to survive in terms of the communities, but certainly lost a lot of its stature and became to some degree part and parcel of the broad history of black people gathering anywhere during the period of Jim Crow. It becomes sort of almost a resistance mechanism in and of itself, the same way church gatherings and things like that, the creation of fraternal societies and so on and so forth, existed to sort of succor the black community and insulate people to some degree, whatever degree they could, you know, this terrible oppression they were facing. Juneteenth became a holiday of that nature. But be that as it may, it made a comeback, Juneteenth, and the way it became a big national holiday, the way it's celebrated now, basically across America. There's 45 states now, I think, that have at least a ceremonial recognition of Juneteenth, even if they don't have the day off. Texas, interestingly enough, you do not get the day off, but it's what's called a skeleton crew holiday there. So you basically just have to have someone to come flick on the lights and then they can go home, I guess. But nevertheless, it's not an official holiday, strangely enough. Maryland, just a couple years back, has done it. And there's a couple, I think a bill passed in a Congress to do a ceremonial resolution, but not a state holiday, but that's something that people have been pushing for some time. There's actually a fair number of Republicans who are for it, so you never know. But either way, the way that became a big national holiday was the Civil Rights Movement. The Poor People's Campaign, in particular, in 1968, where people may know this was sort of the last push of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which was to try to bring together all these people from impoverished backgrounds from all around the country, primarily from the oppressed minorities, but also a lot of folks from Appalachia as well, to basically make a demand that the government end poverty and give people a decent standard of living. As many people know, obviously he was assassinated tragically before the Poor People's Campaign could ever take place. but it still did take place, perhaps at a smaller level than what many people thought, but because of the assassination of Dr. King, they decided they wanted to try to use one of the days that they were slated to be there in the Resurrection City, which was the encampment. They came, they brought all these people, Native Americans, Mexicans, black people from the South, Appalachians, whatever, here to DC for this allegedly open-ended encampment. They camped on the mall. It was called Resurrection City. Anyway, they decided they want to have one of those days be like a big march where people, sort of in commemoration of the March on Washington, people would come from around the country, even though they weren't going to like stay, would come and honor the goal of the Poor People's Campaign and honor the memory of Dr. King. And so there was some back and forth about when the day was going to be. Ultimately, they ended up deciding to do it on Juneteenth and to use that as kind of a hook to what they were doing. And that became an issue where so many more people now were learning about this holiday who didn't know. And even in other places where there were emancipation days, Juneteenth then became kind of the holiday where a lot of that energy went to. Now, I should add that on the West Coast, in like LA, Oakland, Seattle, they have been celebrating Juneteenth since World War II because a lot of people went from Texas and Louisiana to the West to work in the war industries. That's how most black people in the West ended up getting out there, and they took Juneteenth. So it had a little bit of a spread earlier there, but after the Solidarity Day and the Poor People's Campaign, so many people thought, what a great event, what a great holiday, if this is something we should celebrate, and all across the country, more and more places started to set up and do Juneteenth celebrations specifically on that day, even though it may or may not have specific relevance to their state, because it really was an opportunity to use this as a celebration of the emancipation of freed slaves and of the struggle of slaves to free themselves over time. And in the 80s, especially in the early 90s, there was a big grassroots movement as well to start to get states to pass ceremonial resolutions and stuff like that. And that's how that ball started to get rolling. And then now pretty much everywhere you go, I mean, I don't really know of any black community of any significant size anywhere in America where there isn't something that goes on for Juneteenth. Now, in other places, it's bigger than others. Like DC, there's a huge push on Emancipation Day, so people do stuff on Juneteenth, but it isn't as big of like a government holiday, right? Charlottesville, Virginia, where I'm from, that's like the biggest holiday of black people all year, and it kind of is like a rival, an unspoken rival to July 4th, because as Frederick Douglass says, what is the 4th of July to the slave? And so nevertheless, in a lot of places it's more like that, but everywhere you go, there's something going on somewhere, and it's a pretty big deal. And I'll just finish by saying I think that, saying all that, the relevance of the holiday is relatively clear because it's directly related to the issue and the struggle of black people to try to be free and of the concept of black liberation, that you can liberate yourself and be free. That slaves were under bondage for so long and still were able to make a key contribution in freeing themselves. And certainly, I mentioned the black soldiers earlier, perhaps the key factor in the Union being able to ultimately win the Civil War, at least debatable top 3 factors. So nevertheless, you can see that sort of the idea that black people in their own action to liberate themselves can do it, and that the celebration of the holiday on a national level is directly connected to the struggle of black people for recognition inside of the government today. The Reconstruction governments, which they took over and set up. Then of course you have the redemption period in Jim Crow, where the holiday becomes marginalized. Then you have the civil rights movement that elevates it to a new level, and you have the black political representation that comes after that, whatever the contradictions may be, institutionalizing itself over the 80s and 90s and creating the ability of Juneteenth to then take on a much larger proportion from the point of view of like an officially celebrated government holiday. So the rise and fall of the prominence of the holiday is really concomitant to the rise and fall of the struggle of black people to liberate themselves from the current nature of the oppressive conditions that afflict the community. And so I think it's a great holiday in general for any person that feels that struggles for social justice, for liberation, against exploitation and against oppression are right and should be conducted and should be fought and won. It's a great holiday, I think, to reflect on those struggles, the things people have done, the things people will do, and honestly also just to have a good time to, I think, have people sustain themselves in the struggles that exist. And the People's Congress of Resistance, and this is, I think, very relevant to the issue of the Poor People's Campaign and how it came together, because the way the Poor People's Campaign came together really in some ways was a very similar piece, right? What Dr. King certainly and other people recognized was that there were a number of people who were struggling in general around similar issues, right? I mean, obviously they had their own sectoral issues, the Native movement, the movement of Mexican Americans, the Appalachian, coal mining communities and places like that. They had their own realities, but the one thing that underpinned them was the immense and intense poverty that, from Dr. King's perspective, was generated by the system. And that if you wanted to change that system, you had to try to find some way to bring all these people together. That the national government was not, in fact, representative of these people, and, in fact, was complicit in their oppression and exploitation, and they had to be forced by those people coming together to change the nature of what that government was doing. And I think that a lot of what we recognize now is there's a lot of different, if you were to just use the term quote-unquote resistance, which I guess is the buzzword, that's what everyone wants to talk about now, there's so many different things that fall under that. I mean, there's people who I think view that issue as explicitly about Donald Trump as a bad person, and I'm just going to try to be against whatever he is for, which is a pretty decent rule of thumb, I think. I think there are people who are thinking about it more in terms of the direct things that they are losing. I mean, if you look at all of these uprisings, I think that's what we should call them, of people confronting their congresspeople in these offices. That's about Medicaid. These people have this health care and they do not want to give it up, and it's very important to them, and they're willing to make that be heard. And even some of the most right-wing Republicans have been forced to take a step back because of what happened there. This is a random aside, but Mark Meadows, one of the people who wrote the House Republican plan. He's the chair of the Freedom Caucus, and I saw, which is the most hard-right Republicans, I saw he went to a town hall, and he's from North Carolina. The people in the town, they're hot. They're very upset, and so he starts being like, "Well, no, don't worry. We can still vote against the bill. It's not too late." And I was like, okay, if you wrote the bill and passed the bill and you still won't defend it to your own constituents, like, okay, something has changed here, and the power of the people, I think, is manifest. I think there are a lot of people who are looking at it in terms of how they're directly affected in terms of their physical presence in this country or their relationship to their home country and their relatives with immigrants and refugees. Obviously, I think what we've seen here with ICE has been an intense increase in the thuggishness of what they do. There's been an intense increase in the number of deportations, but I almost feel like that in some ways, not that we shouldn't focus on the increase, which is relevant over Obama, who did deport a lot of people, but I think also in the nature of what's being done. Activists, undocumented activists are being directly targeted. They're following school buses. They're arresting and deporting people after they drop their kids off at school. Really in every single way, they're designing the way they do this, these mass raids, where they're just walking into restaurants and saying, everybody, we're just going to take all y'all and see what happens. It's designed to create a nature, I think, a climate of fear. And I think what we've seen, I think, fantastically since 2006 is a lot of undocumented people come forward and say, we're not going to be afraid. And the Trump administration is saying, well, we're going to do everything we can to make you afraid at the point of a gun if we have to. So I think there's a lot of people who think about resistance like that. I think that absolutely, from a civil rights perspective, you see the same thing. Whether it's the voter suppression for black people in this country. I mean, this guy, Chris Kobach, is going to head up the Trump blue ribbon panel on voter suppression, which is crazy because he invented cross-check, which is the system across a bunch of states that probably purged 3 million voters from the voter rolls before this election even happened, almost all of them black, Latino, and Asian. And I won't get into the whole thing, we can talk about it in the thing, but it's, this is the nature of it. Obviously in the LGBTQ community, on every front, the Trump administration is trying to push people back. They don't want to recognize transgender people as people, of course. They want to do whatever little piece they can to stop anyone from having any sort of equality when it comes to a woman's right to choose, for instance. Whatever they can do, whether it's a law, whether it's a Supreme Court justice, whether it's some little change in some code to roll that back as well. So I say all that to say that the concept of resistance is a bit of an umbrella that I think a lot of different people are looking at in a lot of different ways, but it's obviously captured the energy of tens of millions of people in this country, including a lot of people who probably didn't vote. Which is interesting in and of itself. But nevertheless, you can see the power of the concept and what it's doing. And I think from our perspective, we feel very similarly to how people felt in 1968. The national government isn't representative of the average number of people. I think there's one person in there that's an immigrant. Certainly there's no one in there that's not documented. All of them are millionaires. I think this was the first year where every congressperson was a millionaire in history. So every one of them is a millionaire. So, I don't know. I don't have $1 million. Maybe some of you do. But I'm going to go ahead and say that they are not that in touch with the average person. And beyond that, you can just see what they're doing, which is unpopular. I mean, it's very interesting that Republicans, and this is why voter suppression is key, control almost all aspects of government right now, even though on an issue-by-issue basis, the popularity of the issues is in the minority. Like, there's no Republican issue that a majority of people actually support. And I think that's an interesting point in the nature of the government and what a democracy is. It's not representative. I think we also feel that we have to bring people together. People's Congress of Resistance kind of implies that, right? You have an unrepresentative Congress of people who are the 1%, the 0.1%, whatever it may be. You have all these people who are fighting, who it's a much larger majority of people. Can we bring those people together under one roof, as it were, at Howard University later in the fall, and come up with some sort of plan of action, some sort of set of points that says if you claim to be such the quote-unquote resistance, and you claim to represent the people instead of the powerful, an instrument and a movement of people instead of profit, that you have to stand in these principles that have come up from the grassroots of people. And so we're going all across the country. You talk to people in Gary, Indiana, you told me the other day. I've talked to people in West Virginia. I know people in Alabama who are getting talked to about this today, in California, in Washington State, and all of these different places in Washington, D.C., to find the people who are struggling and fighting and resisting, whatever, however exactly they see themselves, to bring them together with like-minded people who are struggling and fighting and resisting, to develop a new pole of people that if there's going to be a resistance, it has to come from below, it has to come from the grassroots, and it has to be truly rooted in the interest of the broad majority of people, and it has to, I think, in every single way, then trump the needs of profit in almost every single circumstance, to privilege itself over ability of people to have food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if it's even on the chair or where it is, but there's a People's Congress of Resistance broadsheet somewhere that will tell you more about it. But ostensibly you are from Washington, D.C., so here we are in ground zero for this event. There's a lot we're going to have to do to continue to build it, to continue to push it, but I think it's a very unique opportunity to do something in this country, if I can paraphrase Rahm Emanuel, never let a crisis go to waste. And Donald Trump has thrown this into a crisis situation, so let's not let it go to waste. Let's make some real changes for the average people. So I appreciate that. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks at the 1DC Juneteenth celebration, where we can continue this conversation. But thank you so much for listening. I'm looking forward if we have a discussion here.